The vanity drawer screeched open. My fingers scraped against splintered wood. Inside, a leather journal with the words, "The Management of the Estate," stamped in gold. My husband's mother had already poisoned his trust, frozen my accounts, and now this. Proof of something darker. The driver's boots pounded down the hall, coming to seize the furniture early. I grabbed the portfolio from my bag, the only weapon I had. One swing, one chance. If I failed, I'd lose everything, including the life growing inside me that I never even knew about. Frost bit at Sarah Miller's fingertips as she gripped the brass handle of the mahogany vanity. The heavy scent of lemon wax and stale lavender clung to the wood, a cloying perfume that seemed designed to mask the smell of decay. She yanked the drawer. It resisted, stuck on a warped runner, before yielding with a sharp crack that echoed through the hollowed-out bedroom. Empty. Only a dusting of gray powder remained where her velvet jewelry rolls once rested. Sarah reached into her pocket, her thumb finding the smooth, cool surface of the river stone. She rubbed it once, twice, 3 times. 10 circles in total. The rhythm grounded her, a physical anchor against the rising tide of panic. Somewhere in this room, the math had to add up. She had spent her career as a landscape architect, ensuring that every slope, every retaining wall, and every drainage pipe was accounted for. Life was a series of load-bearing structures, and right now, her own foundation was screaming under a weight she couldn't see. Her bank accounts had been frozen at dawn. A clerical error, the voice on the phone had said. But the voice had been as cold as a winter morning in Greenwich. Now, the Miller family was moving to strip the very rooms she slept in. She needed leverage. She needed the one thing Evelyn Miller feared, the truth in writing. Downstairs, the front door groaned open. Heavy boots thudded against the marble foyer, the rhythmic, predatory stride of her mother-in-law's private security. "Careful with the sideboard," a muffled voice commanded from the hall. "Mr. Miller wants the marquetry intact." Sarah's breath hitched. She dropped to her knees, her silk skirt snagging on a loose floorboard. She clawed at the hidden seam beneath the vanity's bottom shelf. Her nail snapped, a jagged sting blooming in the quick, but she didn't flinch. She shoved her hand into the dark cavity, skin scraping against rough-hewn pine. Her fingers brushed parchment. She pulled out a crumpled ledger, its leather binding cracked and shedding black flakes. A key slid from the pages, ringing against the floor like a funeral bell. "Sarah." The shadow of a man stretched across the threshold, long and distorted. It wasn't David. It was Miller, the family's driver, a man whose neck was as thick as a tree trunk and whose eyes held the vacant stare of a shark. He didn't smile. He simply exhaled a plume of peppermint-scented breath that cut through the stale lavender. "The movers need the desk, Mrs. Miller," he said. His voice was a low rumble, the sound of gravel shifting under a heavy tire. "Orders from the main house. Everything in this wing is to be crated by noon." Sarah scrambled to her feet, shoving the leather-bound book behind her back. "This is my home, Miller. My furniture. My husband bought this for me. Mr. David's name is on the deed. Mrs. Evelyn's name is on the trust," the driver replied, taking a step into the room. The floorboards groaned under his weight. "That makes it Miller property, and I've been told to be thorough." He looked at her hands, then at the vanity. The gap she'd pried open was obvious, a dark mouth in the wood. Miller's eyes narrowed. He wasn't just a driver. He was a sentry, a man paid to ensure that nothing left this house without Evelyn's seal of approval. "Give me what you found," Miller commanded. He didn't reach for it. He simply loomed, a physical wall of meat and bone blocking the only exit. "It's a diary," Sarah lied, her voice tight. "Personal reflections. Surely even Evelyn doesn't want to audit my thoughts." "Mrs. Miller wants everything," he said, and he lunged. The struggle was sudden and visceral. Miller's hand, calloused and smelling of motor oil, clamped onto Sarah's wrist. The pain was immediate, a hot band of pressure that threatened to snap the bone. Sarah lurched sideways, her shoulders slamming into the mahogany vanity. The heavy scent of the wood and the sharp tang of her own sweat filled her nose. She wasn't a fighter, but she was a builder. She understood leverage. She understood weight. As Miller tried to twist the book from her grasp, she reached for the only weapon she had, her heavy landscape architecture portfolio, a thick leather binder filled with blueprints and site surveys. It sat on the edge of the desk, a 5-pound slab of compressed paper and metal rings. She swung it with every ounce of terror-fueled strength she possessed. The corner of the portfolio caught Miller square in the temple. There was a dull thud, the sound of a mallet hitting a side of beef. Miller grunted, his grip loosening just enough for Sarah to wrench her arm free. He stumbled back, his boots skidding on the polished hardwood, and his head hit the marble hearth of the fireplace with a sickening clack. He didn't go unconscious, but he was dazed, his eyes rolling back as he slumped against the cold stone. Sarah didn't wait to see if he'd get up. She snatched the ledger, the key still tucked inside, and bolted for the door. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She flew down the grand staircase, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The foyer was a maze of bubble wrap and moving blankets. The movers looked up, startled as she blurred past them, but they were too slow to react. She burst through the front door into the blinding white light of a Greenwich afternoon. The air was crisp, smelling of freshly cut grass and the salt spray from the nearby Sound. She reached her SUV just as a silver sedan turned into the long, winding driveway. David. He slammed on the brakes, the tires spitting gravel. He stepped out of the car, his face a mask of exhaustion and confusion. He pushed his glasses up his nose, his hand trembling. "Sarah, what are you doing?" "Miller called my mother. He said you were destroying the inventory." Sarah fumbled with her car door, her fingers slick with sweat. "They're taking everything, David. They're erasing me from this house. Look at what I found. Look at the secrets your mother keeps." She held up the ledger, but David didn't look at the book. He looked at her with a profound, aching suspicion. It was the look of a man who had been told a story so many times he had begun to believe it over the evidence of his own eyes. "Mom said you were having another episode," David whispered, his voice cracking. "She said the stress of the audit was making you paranoid." "Sarah, please, just give me the book. We can go inside and talk to the doctor." The doctor? Sarah backed away, hitting the side of her car. "You brought a doctor here?" "For your safety," David said, taking a cautious step forward, his hands held out as if approaching a wounded animal. "I'm sorry." "I'm so sorry, Sarah. But you're not yourself." The "I'm sorry" hit her like a physical blow. It was his tick, his shield. He was apologizing to the situation, to the air, to the very ground, because he was too weak to stand up to the woman who pulled his strings. Sarah didn't answer. She dived into the driver's seat, slammed the door, and locked it. The engine roared to life, a mechanical scream that drowned out David's pleas. She shifted into reverse, swerving around his sedan, and tore down the driveway, leaving a cloud of dust and the shattered remnants of her marriage behind her. She drove until the mansion was a speck in the rearview mirror, finally pulling over into the shadow of a weeping willow on a quiet side street. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely grip the leather binding of the book. The Management of the Estate. The title was embossed in gold, a cold, clinical phrase for what lay within. Sarah opened the cover. The paper was thick, cream-colored, and covered in a sharp, slanted handwriting she recognized instantly. Evelyn's hand. It wasn't a ledger of assets. It was a ledger of people. Sarah's eyes scanned the pages, her breath hitching as she saw names she recognized. Jennifer, Claire. The women who had come before her. Next to each name was a set of dates, a list of disbursements, and a final column labeled liquidation. The numbers were staggering. Millions of dollars paid to private clinics, to consultants, to men like Miller. It was a roadmap of how Evelyn Miller removed obstacles. But it was the final page that made the world tilt on its axis. There was a new entry. Sarah Miller. Underneath, a list of medications. Sarah frowned. She wasn't on any medication. She looked closer at the dates. They corresponded to the last 3 months. Replacement of psychoregulants with placebo. Success confirmed via pharmacy intercept. A cold, hollow feeling opened up in Sarah's chest. She dropped the book onto the passenger seat, her hand instinctively flying to her stomach. She thought back to the missed cycles she had attributed to the stress of the audit, the morning nausea she'd blamed on the stale lavender in the house. Evelyn hadn't just been trying to ruin her. She had been engineering a legacy. Sarah wasn't just a wife to be discarded. She was a vessel. She was pregnant, and according to this book, she had no say in the matter. The escape wasn't just about her life anymore. It was about the child the Millers already considered their property. The gray sky of the following morning hung over Sarah's landscape design firm like a wet wool blanket. She pulled into the parking lot, her eyes bloodshot from a night spent in a cheap motel, the ledger tucked firmly under her arm. This office was her sanctuary, the one place where she was the architect of her own destiny. But as she stepped through the glass doors, the familiar scent of blueprints and coffee was replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of ozone and the smell of industrial cleaning fluid. 2 men in charcoal suits stood by her desk. They weren't architects. They were moving with a cold, mechanical efficiency, shoving her files into heavy plastic crates. "What is this?" Sarah demanded, her voice echoing in the uncharacteristically silent office. "Who are you?" One of the men turned. He had a face as flat and expressionless as a concrete wall. "Forensic auditors, Mrs. Miller. We're here on behalf of the board. There's been a report of significant financial irregularities." "Irregularities? I own this firm." "The Miller Trust is the primary stakeholder," the man replied, his voice a dull monotone. "And according to these initial findings, you've diverted over $400,000 into offshore accounts over the last 18 months. "That's impossible," Sarah whispered. She looked toward the back office, hoping to see her assistant, Amanda. But the room was empty. "I haven't touched the capital. The digital trail says otherwise. Every signature is yours. Every transfer was authorized from your hardware." The man held up a tablet, showing a list of transactions that looked as real as any she had ever signed. The math was perfect. That was the horror of it. Evelyn didn't just lie. She redesigned reality. She had used Sarah's own professional precision against her, creating a structural collapse that looked entirely like Sarah's fault. Sarah backed away, her heels clicking rhythmically on the polished concrete. Click, click, click. She felt the eyes of her remaining staff on her, the interns she'd mentored, the designers she'd hired. They looked at her not with sympathy, but with the cautious distance people kept from a falling building. "I need my phone," Sarah said, reaching for the desk. "I need to call my lawyer." "Your company hardware has been seized as evidence," the auditor said, stepping between her and the desk. "I'd suggest you leave the premises, Mrs. Miller, before the police arrive to escort you." Sarah turned and fled. She didn't go to her car. She ran toward the small park across the street, her breath coming in jagged stabs. She sat on a wooden bench, the cold dampness of the slats seeping through her coat. She needed to reach Jennifer. Jennifer Taylor, David's first wife. The woman the ledger said had been liquidated to a facility in Vermont. Jennifer was the only one who knew how the trap worked. Sarah pulled a burner phone from her pocket, a precaution she'd taken months ago when she first felt the floorboards of her life shifting. She dialed the number she'd found scratched into the back of the ledger. The line rang once, twice. Then, a series of high-pitched electronic chirps. "The number you are trying to reach has been disconnected," a mechanical voice informed her. Sarah stared at the screen. The phone in her hand began to vibrate. Not a call, but a notification. The screen turned a brilliant, blinding white. A single line of text appeared. "Cleaning in progress." The phone grew hot in her palm. She watched, paralyzed, as her contacts, her photos, and the precious few documents she'd scanned from the ledger vanished. The screen flickered, then died, leaving her with a useless slab of glass and plastic. Evelyn's reach wasn't just physical. It was invisible. It was like 1,000 fists pounding on a door at once, a flood of data designed to drown out any spark of resistance. She returned to the Greenwich house under the cover of a mounting storm. She needed her passport. She needed the physical ledger, which she had hidden in the crawlspace of the carriage house. The mansion looked different in the dark. The white spotlights made the stone walls look like a film set, a hollow facade of wealth. As Sarah stepped through the mudroom door, the house hummed. It was a low, vibrating sound, the sound of the smart security system cycling through its protocols. She reached for the light switch. Nothing happened. "David?" she called out. Her voice sounded thin, swallowed by the vast, cold space of the kitchen. A soft click echoed from the hallway, then another. Sarah walked toward the foyer, her heart racing. As she stepped onto the marble, the heavy oak front door swung shut with a violent thud. The electronic lock engaged with a sound like a deadbolt sliding into place, a final, metallic no. She ran to the door, grabbing the handle. It wouldn't budge. She tried the code on the keypad. The device emitted a low, mocking buzz. "Access denied." "Open the door!" she screamed, pounding on the wood. The house responded. One by one, the motorized shutters on the windows began to descend. They moved with a slow, grinding inevitability, sealing the house in a shell of reinforced steel. The light from the street vanished, replaced by a suffocating, absolute darkness. The air grew heavy. Sarah could smell the sharp, metallic tang of ozone. The climate control system kicked on, but instead of the usual warmth, a blast of frigid, 60-degree air poured from the vents. She was in a cage, a high-tech, multi-million-dollar cage. Evelyn wasn't just locking her out of her life. She was locking her into a nightmare. Sarah fumbled for her flashlight, the beam cutting through the dark like a blade. She moved toward the kitchen, toward the back exit. But as she reached the threshold, the heavy pocket doors slid shut, sealing the room. She was being funneled. The house was moving her, closing off paths until only one remained: the stairs. She climbed, her boots echoing on the high risers. 1, 2, 3. She thought of David's father, Christopher, who used to count these same stairs. Had he felt this same tightening of the throat? This same realization that the walls were no longer his? She reached the master bedroom. The door was open, a rectangle of dim, emergency light spilling onto the carpet. Inside, the room had been stripped. The vanity was gone. The bed was a bare mattress. But in the center of the floor sat a single object, a laptop, its screen glowing with a pale, ghostly light. Sarah approached it. On the screen was a live video feed. It was her, standing in the room, holding the flashlight. The camera angle shifted. Now it showed the hallway, now the kitchen. A voice drifted through the speakers. Evelyn's voice, calm and melodic, like a mother reading a bedtime story. Stability is a choice, Sarah. When a structure is compromised, we don't fix the cracks. We demolish and start again. You're a builder, you should understand that. Where is David? Sarah shouted at the screen. David is where he belongs, Evelyn replied. In the care of people who understand his value. You've become a liability, dear. A hairline fracture in the family foundation, and we simply can't have that. The screen flickered. The video feed changed. It showed a black SUV idling at the end of the driveway. Miller was in the driver's seat, his head bandaged, his eyes fixed on the house. The doors will unlock in 5 minutes, Evelyn said. I suggest you run. It's much more sporting that way. The rain was a solid wall of water as Sarah's SUV hurtled down the back roads of Connecticut. The windshield wipers worked in a frantic, rhythmic thwack-thwack that was slightly out of sync with the heartbeat thudding in her ears. The road ahead was a blur of gray asphalt and encroaching tree line. She was driving toward Vermont, toward Jennifer. It was the only move left on the board. In the rearview mirror, 2 pinpricks of light appeared. They were distant at first, twin stars in the deluge. But they grew with terrifying speed. Sarah pressed the accelerator, the engine groaning as the car climbed a steep, slick grade. The headlights behind her didn't waver. They didn't blink. They simply loomed, larger and brighter, until they filled her entire mirror. The black SUV rammed her. The impact was a bone-jarring shock that sent Sarah's head snapping back against the rest. The sound was a deafening crunch of metal on metal, like a giant crushing a soda can. Her car fishtailed, the tires screaming as they lost their grip on the rain-slicked pavement. No, 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 Sarah whimpered, white-knuckling the steering wheel. The SUV hit her again, harder this time, aiming for her rear quarter panel. It was a pit maneuver, a professional takedown. Sarah felt the back of her car swing out, the world spinning in a dizzying blur of dark trees and gray sky. She didn't fight the spin. She remembered a design project on this very road, the way the embankments had been graded for runoff. She steered into the slide, aiming for the soft, muddy shoulder rather than the jagged tree line. The car plunged off the road, the suspension screaming as it hit the ditch. Mud sprayed across the windshield, blinding her. With a final, violent jolt, the SUV came to a halt, tilted at a precarious 45-degree angle in the muck. Silence rushed back in, broken only by the ticking of the cooling engine and the relentless drumming of rain on the roof. Sarah sat for a moment, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She tasted copper. She'd bitten her lip. She checked her limbs. Everything moved. The airbags hadn't deployed, a small mercy that meant she wasn't pinned. She looked out the side window. The black SUV had stopped at the edge of the road. A door opened. A figure stepped out, silhouetted against the high-intensity beams. Miller. He didn't run. He walked with a slow, deliberate pace, his boots crunching on the gravel. He was coming to finish the liquidation. Sarah didn't wait. She scrambled out the passenger door, falling into the knee-deep mud. The cold water soaked through her jeans instantly, a biting chill that made her teeth chatter. She crawled into the dense undergrowth, the thorns of wild blackberry bushes tearing at her coat and skin. She heard Miller reach the car. She heard the sound of glass shattering as he broke the driver's side window. "Mrs. Miller?" His voice called out, hauntingly polite. "Don't make this harder. We just want to take you to the clinic." Sarah pressed herself into the dirt, the smell of wet earth and rotting leaves filling her nose. She watched through the screen of branches as Miller circled her car, his flashlight beam cutting through the rain. He was looking for a body. When he didn't find one, he paused, his head tilting as he scanned the tree line. Sarah didn't stay to see if he found her tracks. She turned and ran into the woods, guided only by the occasional flash of lightning and the desperate driving need to survive. 3 hours later, shivering and covered in a layer of dried mud, Sarah stood before the gates of the St. Jude Wellness Center. It didn't look like a prison. It looked like a luxury spa, all white stone and glass, nestled in the rolling green hills of Vermont. But as she approached the entrance, the smell hit her. Not the scent of pine or expensive candles, but the sharp, metallic tang of ozone. The same smell as the Greenwich mansion. She used the key she'd found in the ledger to slip through a side maintenance door. The interior was a labyrinth of white corridors, the air so sterile it made her throat ache. She moved like a shadow, her damp socks silent on the linoleum. She found the room at the end of a long, windowless hall. Room 402. Inside, a woman sat by a window that didn't open. She was pale, her skin almost translucent, and her hair had the dull, brittle look of someone who hadn't seen the sun in years. She was humming a tune, a rhythmic, haunting version of Happy Birthday. "Jennifer?" Sarah whispered. The woman didn't turn. She continued to hum, her fingers tracing a pattern on the arm of her chair. "Jennifer, my name is Sarah. I'm David's wife." The humming stopped. Jennifer Taylor turned her head slowly, her eyes wide and darting, as if looking for hidden cameras in the corners of the ceiling. "David?" she whispered. Her voice was a dry rasp. Is he sorry?" "He's trapped," Sarah said, kneeling beside her. "They're all trapped. Jennifer, I found the ledger. I know what Evelyn did to you." Jennifer flinched at the name. She reached out, her hand trembling, and touched Sarah's cheek. Her fingers were ice cold. "You smell like the rain," she whispered. "I haven't smelled the rain in 3 years." "I'm getting you out of here," Sarah promised. "You can't," Jennifer said, her gaze drifting back to the window. "The actors are everywhere. They play the doctors, they play the nurses. They even played the man I thought I loved." "What do you mean, actors?" "Evelyn doesn't use shadows," Jennifer said. "She uses a stage. She hires people to be your friends, your confidants. They tell you you're crazy until you believe them. They show you evidence of things you never did until you can't trust your own memory." A cold prickle danced across Sarah's skin. She thought of her office, the auditors, the digital trail of embezzlement. "Marcus," Sarah whispered. "The legal secretary?" Jennifer nodded, a small, sad smile touching her lips. "He's very good. He played my brother for 6 months. He's not a lawyer, Sarah. He's a performer. His name is Marcus Reed. He specializes in immersion therapy. That's what Evelyn calls it." Sarah stood up, the room spinning. Marcus, the man who had been her bumbling assistant for a year, The man who had accidentally left files on her desk suggesting David was having an affair. The man who had been her only friend during the audit. He wasn't a friend. He was a script. "I have to go," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "I have to get back to Greenwich. The gala is in 2 days." "Don't go back," Jennifer pleaded, clutching Sarah's sleeve. "She'll put you in the room next to mine. She'll make you hum the songs too. I have the ledger, Jennifer. I have the one thing she can't act her way out of." Sarah turned to leave, but as she reached the door, she heard the rhythmic pop, pop, pop of knuckles cracking in the hallway. She froze. She knew that sound. It was the sequence Marcus used before he spoke. Thumb, index, pinky. "She's in there, isn't she?" a familiar, cheerful voice asked. Sarah ducked behind a medical cart as the door swung open. Marcus Reed stepped into the room. He wasn't wearing his bumbling secretary glasses. He was wearing a sharp, tailored suit, and his posture was upright, confident. "Hello, Jennifer," Marcus said. "It looks like we have a guest. Sarah, come out. There's no point in hiding. The set is already built." Sarah didn't move. She gripped the handle of the cart, her knuckles white. "Evelyn is very impressed with you," Marcus continued, walking toward the window. "Most people break after the car crash. But you have structural integrity. It's a shame we have to demolish you." He turned, his eyes scanning the room. But then again, every great performance needs a tragic ending. Subverted Beat 2.6. Sarah Miller spent the 36 hours leading up to the 4th of July gala in a state of hyper-focused clarity. She had escaped the facility through a laundry chute, a desperate, bruising plunge that had left her with a cracked rib and a singular purpose. She was no longer just a wife or an architect. She was a whistleblower with a suitcase full of dynamite. She sat in the back of a rented sedan in a Starbucks parking lot, the leather-bound ledger resting on her lap. Her plan was logical, precise, and backed by years of managing complex projects. She would infiltrate the gala, the one night of the year when the Greenwich elite gathered at the Miller estate. She would use the distraction of the fireworks to get to the library, scan the ledger into the estate's main server, and broadcast the management of the estate onto every screen in the house during Evelyn's keynote speech. It was a smart move. The gala was a high-visibility event with hundreds of witnesses. Evelyn couldn't make her disappear in front of the mayor, the chief of police, and the board of directors. Publicity was Sarah's armor. She had even contacted a contact at the Greenwich Sentinel, promising a story that would rock the county. Confidence surged through her as she donned a server's uniform she'd acquired from a sympathetic former employee. She looked at herself in the rearview mirror. The mud was gone, replaced by a mask of professional invisibility. She had the ledger. She had the access codes she'd stolen from Marcus's desk weeks ago. She was ready. As she drove toward the estate, the first positive signs appeared. The security at the outer gate was overwhelmed by the sheer volume of caterers and guests. Sarah was waved through with a cursory glance at her forged ID. She parked in the service lot, her heart light. "You're late for the briefing," a head waiter barked as she entered the kitchen. "Grab a tray of champagne and get to the west lawn." Sarah nodded, keeping her head down. It was working. She was inside the belly of the beast, and the beast didn't even know she was there. She felt a wave of relief wash over her. The panic of the last week began to recede, replaced by the cool, steady hum of a plan in motion. She would expose the truth, save Jennifer, and reclaim her life. 1, 2, 3. The crisis was almost over. She moved through the glittering crowd, the scent of expensive perfume and roasted lamb filling the air. She saw David standing near the fountain, looking pale and diminished in his tuxedo. Her heart ached for him, but she stayed focused. She reached the library wing, the heavy oak doors standing slightly ajar. She slipped inside, the silence of the room a stark contrast to the roar of the party outside. She moved toward the central terminal, the ledger clutched to her chest. But as she reached for the keyboard, she stopped. Something was wrong. The room smelled of peppermint, fresh, sharp, and overwhelming. She turned. Evelyn Miller was sitting in a high-backed wing chair in the corner, a glass of sherry in her hand. She wasn't surprised. She was waiting. "You've always had a flair for the dramatic, Sarah," Evelyn said, her voice as smooth as silk. "But you've forgotten one thing about this town. I don't just live here. I am here." The library doors burst open. Not movers, not security, but two uniformed police officers. "Sarah Miller?" the lead officer asked. He didn't look like a henchman. He looked like a man doing a difficult job. "You're under arrest for grand larceny and the theft of protected corporate documents." "Theft?" Sarah gasped, holding up the book. "This is evidence. This book proves—" "That book," Evelyn interrupted, standing up slowly, "was reported stolen from our private archives 3 days ago, along with $400,000 from your firm's capital account. We have the security footage of you prying open the vanity, Sarah. We have the witnesses who saw you assault a staff member." Sarah looked at the officers. "No, you don't understand. She's framing me. Look at the names in this book. Look at Jennifer Taylor." The officer took the book from her hands with a look of professional pity. "Mrs. Miller, we've already reviewed the ledger you're talking about. The one we recovered from your car? It's a collection of architectural sketches and some very disturbing notes about the family. There's nothing in there about a Jennifer Taylor." Sarah's world tilted. "What? No, I have it right here." She looked down at the book in the officer's hand. The leather cover was the same. The gold embossing was the same. But as he flipped it open, she saw only blank pages and her own frantic, handwritten notes about conspiracies and shadows. The switch. Miller hadn't been trying to kill her in the woods. He had been waiting for her to leave the car so he could swap the books. "The Sentinel reporter you called?" Evelyn said, stepping closer, her eyes glittering with cold triumph. "He's a cousin of mine. He was very concerned about your mental state. He's the one who called the police to ensure you didn't hurt yourself tonight." The trap snapped shut. By trying to use the gala as a stage for the truth, Sarah had provided Evelyn with the perfect audience for her breakdown. She wasn't a whistleblower. She was a fugitive, caught red-handed with stolen property, her evidence nothing more than the ramblings of a woman who had finally lost her grip on reality. "Take her out the back," Evelyn commanded. "We don't want to spoil the fireworks." The conservatory was a cage of glass and humidity. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the cloying sweetness of night-blooming jasmine. Outside, the first of the 4th of July fireworks exploded, casting jagged, colorful shadows across the tangled vines and towering ferns. Sarah had managed to slip away from the officers in the chaos of a kitchen fire. A small, desperate act of sabotage she'd triggered by shoving a metal tray into a high-voltage outlet. She was bleeding from a gash on her forehead, her server's vest torn. She had the real ledger. She'd found it. Miller hadn't swapped it in the woods. He'd swapped it in the car before the crash. But Sarah, the architect, the woman who checked every measurement twice, had hidden the real book in the lining of her landscape portfolio, which she'd buried in the mud before Miller reached the wreck. She had retrieved it an hour ago, a sodden, filthy prize. But she wasn't alone. "It's a beautiful night for a funeral," a voice said from the shadows of the palm fronds. Evelyn Miller stepped into the light of a red firework. She looked different. The mask of the frail, grieving matriarch was gone. Her posture was rigid, her eyes wide and predatory. "You just won't stay in the ground, will you?" Evelyn asked. "The truth doesn't bury easily," Sarah panted, clutching the ledger to her chest. "I'm going to the server room, Evelyn. I'm going to show everyone what you are." "You're going nowhere." Evelyn lunged. The speed was shocking. She didn't move like a woman in her 60s. She moved like a coil of steel. She slammed Sarah back against a stone planter, her hands locking around Sarah's throat. Sarah clawed at Evelyn's face. But the older woman was possessed by a terrifying, desperate strength. "Do you know why I killed Christopher?" Evelyn hissed, her face inches from Sarah's. The smell of peppermint was nauseating. "Because he was weak, like David. He wanted to give away the foundation. He wanted to let the world in. I built this family. I protected the walls." She reached into her silk jacket and pulled out a long, shimmering scarf. She looped it around Sarah's neck, twisting it with a brutal, practiced efficiency. Sarah's vision began to gray. The sound of the fireworks became a dull, underwater thud. She felt the life being squeezed out of her, the structural collapse of her own body. She reached out, her fingers brushing the edge of a heavy terracotta planter. It was filled with wet soil and a massive, ornamental fern. She didn't try to pull Evelyn off. She used her legs. She kicked the base of the planter with every ounce of strength she had left. The heavy pot tipped. It didn't fall on Evelyn, but it caught her leg, pinning her ankle against the marble floor with a sickening crunch. Evelyn screamed, her grip loosening. Sarah tore the scarf from her neck, gasping for air, the cold, humid oxygen burning her lungs. She scrambled away, leaving Evelyn trapped beneath the weight of the stone and earth. "David!" Sarah screamed, stumbling toward the library. "David, help me!" She reached the library terminal. Her fingers flew across the keys. She bypassed the security, the 1,000 fists of Evelyn's digital wall finally yielding to the physical reality of the ledger in her hand. She fed the pages into the high-speed scanner. Uploading. 10%, 40%, 80%. The screen flashed red. Encryption required. Enter passcode. Sarah stared at the screen. The math was right. The data was there. But the door was locked. "Looking for this?" She turned. Marcus Reed stood in the doorway, holding a small silver thumb drive. He wasn't smiling anymore. He looked bored. "The digital world belongs to those who write the code, Sarah, not those who just follow the blueprints." He walked to the terminal and typed a single, long string of characters. The upload vanished. The screen went black. "The intervention team is here," Marcus said, checking his watch. "And they have a very special sedative just for you. Subverted beat 3.5. The library doors didn't just open, they were breached. 4 men in white clinical coats entered with the synchronized precision of a SWAT team. They didn't carry weapons, but the sight of the heavy leather restraints and the gleaming silver trays was more terrifying than any gun. Behind them stood Dr. Thomas Scott, his tie perfectly knotted, his expression one of professional, hollow concern. "Sarah, dear," Dr. Scott said, his voice a soothing, melodic hum. "You've had a very difficult night. The hallucinations, the violence, it's all part of the break. We're here to help you get back to a stable place." Sarah backed into the mahogany bookshelves, the leather bindings of the books cold against her spine. "I'm not hallucinating," Marcus, tell them. Tell them about the ledger. Marcus Reed looked at the doctor and sighed, a perfect performance of a man burdened by a friend's madness. She's been talking about a book for hours, doctor. She thinks I'm an actor. She thinks Evelyn is trying to... Well, it's quite vivid. It's a classic defensive projection, Dr. Scott noted, nodding to the orderlies. David! Sarah screamed as her husband appeared in the doorway. David, look at me. You know I'm not crazy. You saw the vanity. You saw Miller. David Miller stood frozen, his hand hovering near his glasses, pushing them up a bridge that was already sweating. He looked at Sarah, disheveled, bleeding, screaming about actors. And then he looked at his mother, who was being helped into the room by a maid, her leg bandaged, her face a mask of tragic endurance. I'm sorry, Sarah, David whispered. The words were a death sentence. I'm so sorry. But you hurt her. You hurt Mom. She's in a wheelchair because of you. She tried to kill me. The evidence says otherwise, Sarah, Dr. Scott said, stepping forward. He reached for a syringe on the tray. This is just a mild sedative. It will help the noise stop. Sarah felt a surge of hope. David was her husband. He knew her. He knew her rituals, her stone, her mind. If she could just reach him, if she could just show him the physical reality of her fear, he would snap out of it. She lunged toward him, not to attack, but to grab his hand, to ground him. David, please, the baby, think about the baby. David flinched, but he didn't move toward her. He moved back. He looked at her hand as if it were a claw. Mom told me about the phantom pregnancy, Sarah, David said, his voice trembling. She said you'd use that to try and stay. She showed me the medical records. You're not pregnant. You're just sick. The false positive of her hope shattered. The betrayal wasn't just that he didn't believe her. It was that Evelyn had already occupied the space of his fatherhood. She had rewritten the very life inside Sarah's womb as a symptom of madness. The orderlies moved in. Sarah fought, her nails raking the white coats, but they were too strong. They pinned her to the Persian rug, the scent of dust and old wool filling her nose. She felt the sharp, cold sting of the needle in her arm. There we go, Dr. Scott whispered. The world is going to get very quiet now. As the sedative took hold, Sarah's vision began to blur. The last thing she saw was Evelyn Miller standing over her. The older woman wasn't in a wheelchair. She was standing perfectly straight, her eyes cold and triumphant. She leaned down, her peppermint breath hot against Sarah's ear. The foundation is secure, Sarah. Sleep well. The lights of the library faded into a single pinpoint star, then vanished into the absolute dark. The interior of the private ambulance smelled of new car spray and the sharp, clinical tang of antiseptic. Sarah lay on the gurney, her wrists and ankles bound by heavy nylon straps. The world was a rhythmic thump-thump of tires on asphalt, a hollow, vibrating cage. She felt the weight of the child in her belly, a heavy, grounding reality that the sedative couldn't erase. They told her she wasn't pregnant. They told her she was broken. But she was an architect. She knew how to read a site. She reached into her pocket. They had taken her phone, her keys, her ledger, but they had missed the stone. The small, smooth river stone was still there, tucked into the hidden seam of her waistband. She rubbed it. Once, twice, 10 times. The fog in her mind began to clear. She looked at the attendant sitting in the corner, a young man who was more interested in his phone than his patient. On the wall of the ambulance sat her landscape architecture laser measure tool. It had been in her pocket when they grabbed her, and the orderly had tossed it onto the counter, thinking it was a harmless piece of stationery. Sarah knew that laser. It was a high-intensity Class 3 beam designed for long-distance site surveys. She maneuvered her bound hands, her fingers straining against the nylon. She reached for the tool. Her fingertips brushed the cold plastic. She hooked it, pulling it toward her. She waited for the ambulance to slow for a turn. She clicked the button. A brilliant, blinding green beam erupted from the tool. She aimed it directly into the rearview mirror. The driver screamed, the light reflecting into his eyes with the intensity of 1,000 suns. The ambulance swerved, the tires shrieking as the driver slammed on the brakes. The vehicle skidded, fishtailing across the road before slamming into a guardrail. The engine stalled. Silence rushed back in. Sarah didn't wait. She used the sharp edge of the laser tool's battery cover to saw through the nylon straps. It was slow, agonizing work, the plastic biting into her skin. But she didn't flinch. She was free. She kicked open the back doors. The night air was cold and sharp, smelling of pine and rain. She was 5 miles from the estate. She began to run. The gala was reaching its crescendo. The fireworks were a constant roar in the sky, a symphony of light and sound that masked Sarah's approach. She didn't go through the front gates. She went through the drainage tunnels she had designed herself 3 years ago. She emerged in the conservatory, her clothes soaked, her face set in a mask of grim determination. She didn't go for the server. She didn't go for the ledger. She went for the projection booth. The Millers were using a high-definition projection mapping system to display the family history onto the white stone walls of the mansion. It was a show of power, a digital monument to their legacy. Sarah bypassed the security with a physical override. She jammed her metal stone rubbing tool into the cooling fan of the main processor. The system stuttered, the 1,000 fists of the encryption failing as the hardware began to overheat. She hijacked the feed. She didn't use a digital file. She placed the physical ledger, the one she had hidden in her vest, under the high-definition document camera used for the presentation. On the side of the Greenwich mansion, 50 feet high and visible to every guest, the pages of the management of the estate appeared. The crowd went silent. The only sound was the crackle of the fireworks. Jennifer Taylor. Liquidation. Dr. Scott. $500,000 disbursement. Christopher Miller. Final disposition. And then, the final entry. The one Sarah had found in the back of the book, written in a shaky, dying hand. Evelyn did it. She pushed him. I saw her. Christopher. The image was crystalline. The truth was a mountain of light that no lie could overshadow. Evelyn Miller stood on the dais, her face illuminated by the gargantuan image of her own crimes. She looked small. She looked fragile. She looked like a building whose load-bearing walls had finally given way. David stood in the front row. He looked at the wall, then at his mother. He didn't apologize. He didn't push his glasses up his nose. He walked toward the police officers who were already moving toward the stage. That's her, David said, his voice clear and steady. That's the woman who killed my father. 6 months later, the air in Seattle was a soft, persistent drizzle. It wasn't the cold, predatory rain of Greenwich. It was a healing rain, a quiet mist that nourished the ferns and mosses of the garden Sarah had designed for herself. She sat on a cedar bench, her hand resting on the swell of her stomach. The baby kicked, a strong, rhythmic thud that reminded her that some structures were built to last. Evelyn was in a cell, awaiting trial for a dozen different crimes. Marcus Reed had vanished, a ghost of a man who had never really existed. Jennifer was in a real clinic, one with windows that opened and doctors who didn't hum "Happy Birthday." Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out the Riverstone. She looked at it for a long time, feeling the smooth surface, the weight of it. She didn't rub it. She leaned forward and placed the stone in the center of the garden path, a small, permanent fixture in a world she had built for herself. The math finally added up. The foundation was solid. Sarah Miller stood up, took a deep breath of the damp, clean air, and walked toward her new home.